paid for the bride? Rachel. And what was the wage there? 7 years. And then you got Leah, and then had to work another 7 years, but at least he got both at the end of 7. That's right. Now let me press it a little bit more. What did David pay Saul for his first wife? David said, I don't have any money. And Saul said, don't worry about that. I think it was Saul. I'm almost positive that it was. He said, what can I give you? And what did he say? You remember? It was a bride price. How many was it, Kel? Do you remember? I think it was 100 Philistine foreskins. They killed the Philistines. Okay? That's the bride price, and you see that through Scripture. So, when you marry and you pledge, the two fathers would come together, they would discuss the bride price, they would settle on the bride price, and then they would share a cup of wine that essentially consummates that deal. And from that day on, those two are engaged, and it's even more than engaged. I mean, today in our society, you can, it's very different. You're still not technically pledged until you say, I do at the altar. Back then, it was very, very different. And then for Joseph, and I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall at that time, is at the moment that Mary stepped from behind the door or was told that she is with child. And this noble, godly man that the text says that he was, as a matter of fact, it says here that Joseph was an honorable man. As a matter of fact, we see that this is how the birth of Jesus Christ came about. And because Joseph, verse 19, because Joseph, her husband, was a righteous man and did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. So you can see the price that even Joseph had to pay here. Joseph, we talk a lot about him. We don't know a whole lot about him. We know when he gets older, when we leave, the last time we hear about Joseph is when Jesus is in the temple and he left his family and they had to go back and find him. That's the last time we hear of Joseph. And we think that Joseph probably died at a relatively young age. And essentially, Jesus then was in charge of his mother. That's why when Jesus is hanging on the cross, he says to John, behold your mother. He's passing off that responsibility to the Apostle John. So here we see Joseph having to go through a very tumultuous time. As a matter of fact, this was a deal breaker. She would have been ostracized for the rest of her life, and probably was in some regard. Some people, I'm sure, just never believed that there was what I will call the Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception to a Catholic is not the birth conception of Jesus, it's the conception of Mary. So we won't go there, but when I say Immaculate Conception, the amazing conception of Christ through the Holy Spirit that we read about here, that's what I'm talking about. And that's another comparison and contrast, if you will, between Protestants and Catholics. Immaculate Conception to a Catholic means the birth of Mary because she was sinless, supposedly. I don't believe that for a moment. I think Mary was a sinner like the rest of us, and a Savior who was going to be her son. So that's what we have through there. And now I want to go to chapter 2, but before we go to chapter 2, everything that we learn in class has to attach to something you already know. So before we get to the text, and I will get to the text and I'll read the text, but before we do that, I want to load you up with a whole lot of information. So when you read the next sentence in our text, you will be able to have a lot more knowledge. You'll have a lot more of an idea. You'll have pictures in your mind of what the situation was like here at the beginning of chapter 2. So let me begin with a story. It's a true story. Might want to focus on that, guys. Or put the... You might have to advance it for me. Or maybe the focus isn't on the screen. Thanks, appreciate it. There we go. 40 BC. This is 40 years before Jesus. 40 years before Jesus, there's a man named Herod the Great. He's been put in charge of the Upper Galilee and some areas around Galilee. And essentially, he rules this area. This is in Bethsaida. This is a picture of where Peter, Andrew, James, John grew up, and other apostles. And it's amazing to me as you stand in these places. I love this picture just because it's not so much a great picture, but it doesn't show you a lot of development. Because this is what they would have seen when they would have been playing. This is what they would have seen when they would have been out working and so on. And if you look over, what we're doing right now is looking across the top of the Sea of Galilee, the northern side. And as you look north, you'll see this imposing mountain with the valley here. This is called Mount Arbel. And there used to be a community that lived atop of it and on the sides of it. They actually had built, this is Mount Arbel, and this is the valley that you see right here. It's called the Valley of the Doves. Jesus, why? Because there's lots of doves there even today. Most of the time today it's a pasture. If we ever go to Israel and you feel like a brisk walk, we'll walk to the top of it. Or climb in some cases because the cliffs. Shelby, you would like that. You would love to get out there and be in the middle of it, and that's what you can do at Mount Arbel. A lot of people do that. I've done it a couple times, and it's a real privilege to get to walk up there and see. So you come into the Valley of the Doves. Jesus would have walked through this valley a number of times, going to Nazareth or coming back and forth from different places. Have anybody has been to Mount Arbel? Yeah. Most people don't climb it. And that's one of the things that we do in our tours was to be able to climb it and own it. It's like Masada. It's no fun to take the tram up to Masada. I've taken the tram. The funnest thing to do is walk it. And you get sweaty and hot, and you feel what those Roman soldiers felt. Same way here at Mount Arbel. And we also know that Jesus sought high places. So Jesus sought high places to pray. He went to the tops of mountains, and we understand that and know that. And so I'm thinking... And this is only a 45-minute walk from the general vicinity. Mary Magdalene, it was a 25-minute walk for her from where she lived when she was young. So was Jesus up here at the top? Text doesn't say, but I'll tell you it's the most imposing, the highest place around there. I'll bet you he was up there, if nothing else, to get a really neat view of the places that he lived. And here are some of the homes that people lived in. And these people were troublemakers. Okay, now keep in mind they probably had some other dwelling space. This has been worn away over the centuries. They probably had some terraced stone of some sort that helped, provide some boundaries. But it was a tough place to live. As a matter of fact, we know about a place. This community of people is talked about in Josephus. And Herod the Great had just started to rule this area. And these people that lived here, when people would come through this valley with trade, merchants would come through with their caravans, and if they were Roman, they would steal from them. They would beat them. They might kill them. And it became to be a major issue in people coming through this valley to get to Capernaum or wherever they were going, and it was disrupting trade, it was disrupting life, and it became a real problem. As a matter of fact, they called it the Valley of the Thieves. That was the reputation that this place had, and Herod was going to stop it. So what he did is he came down here with Roman soldiers. As a matter of fact, when we go up here, I love to think about that big crest of a Roman legion maybe, or whatever portion of the army that they had to come and address this, marching through that valley to come there to address these God-fearing Jews who essentially were very, very passionate. You may want to call these people the beginning of the Zealots. These people were passionate about God's word. They couldn't stand Rome. They couldn't stand the Greek Hellenistic lifestyle that they're pervading. We'll give you another example of that after a while. These people were not going to get sucked into the culture of Rome like the people in Tiberias did. Remember we talked about Tiberias? This is right on the edge, right on the other side of this. If you come down to Tiberias over here, that's where you start to get these compromisers. The people said, oh yeah, you can have a Roman eagle on the temple, it's no big deal. To an Orthodox Jew, they're like, no, that violates what God said about idols. We will not tolerate it. And they were passionate people, even to the extent people to ensure that trying to, it's just like what you see today with guerrilla warfare to some degree. People, but to some degree, you can understand their perspective. It's like somebody came in here and said, no more communion on Saturday night. How are you going to feel about that? Yeah, that's no more communion. What do you mean? Do that. Is that worth fighting for? You'd have to decide all that, you see. And that's what they had to decide, those types of things. Anyway, so Herod sends us so up, they can't get to them. We're hostile. Matter of fact, here's another one of the houses here. This was talking about some of the terror that they had up here, and you can walk right in. He comes up there, they can't get to him. In fact, what they had to do is lower men's chests. They put them in these chests, essentially like a scaffold, and they lowered them down, hooks and torches. And what they would do is, and they would smoke the people out. And several thousand died up here at the hand of Herod. There was one especially moving, which I don't have time to read it, but it's in Josephus. Just look up Josephus and go to, if you look into Josephus, in the if you follow the timelines and see where this is, it's at the beginning of Herod the Great's reign at Arbela. He comes in and he got these big hooks and he's pulling the people. And there's one moving story of I don't know where the father was. Comes out with his children in his hands. And Herod looks up, the grandfather's going to do is, I am not going to let my kids get sucked into this culture. I'd rather them die. And Herod supposedly says, don't do that, essentially. And I'm paraphrasing. You don't have to do that. But the grandfather, full of understanding, full of his faith was going to be compromised, the faith of his grandchildren was going to be compromised, cast his grandchildren over the cliff. And there they died. And then he cast himself down as well, as opposed to being sucked into the culture of Rome and forced to be a slave or forced to be in this world of what they would have considered a very, very sinful world. And there they died, and this rebellion was put down. And there we begin the reign of Herod the Great. This is climbing up the mountain. It's very steep, but when you get up there, the views are fascinating. This is the triangle. This is where the religious Jews lived of Jesus' time. Mary Magdala, this is the village of Magdala. And so you can see when it says, matter of fact, it says right here, Matthew 15:39, since we're in Matthew. And he sent away the multitude, got into a boat. He's probably in Capernaum, back over here. Got into a boat and came to the region of Magdala. That's right here. So you know it's not very far. You know, it's really neat to stand there and contemplate the history, because I'll tell you, when you do that, it becomes, if you don't feel it already, it becomes real. These people really walked here, and that's fascinating to me. So we get to this man called Herod the Great, 73 BC to 4 BC. 4 BC, we have these calendar issues. We don't have time to go into those. It's a long study to deal into the calendar issues. Jesus, he essentially died in about 0 BC. Jesus was born in 0. Before he died, he probably died between, John MacArthur came up and did the math at one juncture, and he said Herod died probably between 4 to 6 months after Jesus was born. Okay, so when we know about Mary and Joseph fleeing to Egypt, they didn't have to be there very long. He died right after that. As a matter of fact, when you look at this in context of Herod's life, it's amazing, because this guy he had lost it toward the end of his life. His life can be divided up into about 3 different parts. Number one, the first part, the first third of his reign, is doing nothing but consolidating his power. This guy was a political insider of Rome. Let me tell you who some of his friends are, and let me ask you if you've ever heard of these people. Julius Caesar. You ever heard of him? How about Mark Antony? How about Cleopatra? How about Brutus? All these people he was in tight relationship with. He knew these people. He bargained with these people. His father knew those people. He was a political insider from day one, and his whole purpose, his whole life was spent defending and gaining power and money. As a matter of fact, he did really, really well. As a matter of fact, he would take from the rich, oftentimes who were found to be in cahoots, to throw him out of power, and he would take their wealth, all under the blessing of Rome. Rome, to the world, this guy was a pretty good leader. When he went to battle, like at Arbela and other places where he put down Jewish rebellions, he did really well. This man was known King of the Jews. That's what he called himself, and he liked that title, even though he was not fully Jewish. He came from Idumea, which is south of the Negev desert, which would probably be around Jordan today. He was not fully Jewish, and that's why the Jews didn't like him. He spent a lot of time in Rome. Probably, as I read a book on him over the last week, and I could, at least off the top of my head, he went to Rome at least 4 times to visit with Octavian, with Julius Caesar, with Pompey before that. And he spent his life consolidating power for himself. So that's the first third of his life, and it's a violent life. If I could give you one picture of his life in modern day terms, I would say Jerry Springer Show. You ever seen the Jerry Springer Show? No, I don't. Yeah, I mean, it's a terrible show. I don't know if it's even still on. And I don't mean that to be funny. If you've ever watched that show, it's filled full of lost people who are absolutely wallowing in their own sin. They're wallowing in their own, they're lost. And it is a sad, sad story to watch that show. Families are fighting against each other. Mothers hate daughters. Sons hate mothers. Fathers, if they're in the picture, don't care about the sons. This man divorced his first wife and cast out his 3-year-old son because he wanted another woman who was Hasmonean so he could have more power with the Jewish people. Forget Doris, that was her name. Just cast her and the 3-year-old son out. I'm going to go marry a woman named Mariamna. And that's the kind of man he was. It was not about God's word. It was not about living a life that would be glorifying to the Lord. It was a life about strengthening himself and his progeny. And here's the sad thing. When you look at it, the really sad thing is that he thought he was doing well. You remember in the Gospel of John when it says, Jesus is he's just left the Last Supper and he's probably walking over to the Mount of Olives, and he says to you, people are going to flog you. They're going to kick you out of the synagogues, and they're going to think that they're serving God. Was that John 15? We just read that the other night, didn't we? And that's what he thought he was doing. The second part of his life was spent building. And oh, building did he do. Amazing structures that still you can go and see and appreciate. Absolutely incredible builder, architect. How much did he have personally? I don't really know. Maybe he hired people to do it, but he had the wealth and the insight. And it was amazing. And that's one of the ways that he would curry favor with his Roman friends. He would build temples. He would send them huge amounts of money in tribute. So when Antony, before he would arrive in Egypt to talk with Antony, he may send him a massive tribute. You want to keep your friends? Pay them. Anybody who works in Frankfurt understands that. Anybody who works in Washington understands that.
Did he have a pretty free reign from Rome because
He did to a degree. Yes, he did. But you know something? What's interesting to me, even through the books that I've read just this last week and the things that I've learned in the past, it was not free for all. He did have an extraordinary amount of power. But for example, when his two sons, when he thought that they were in cahoots to get him out, he ended up killing them, by the way, executing them, but he had to do so. He took them to trial in Rome. He dragged them to Rome to go in front of Caesar to get them essentially executed. Can you believe that? That's a long trip with your kids to try to go get them executed. Unreal. I mean, it's hard to even imagine. So no, he did not. And as a matter of fact, he played the system. He played the system a lot. Oftentimes when he was in charge of killing and being behind the murder of a high priest. What did he do? He made up lies. He told people other things that weren't true, and he essentially curried favor, and he got all the favors back, and he kept those relationships going. And it was overlooked eventually. He was called. He was asked, why'd you kill the high priest? Well, because. And anybody can. He was a brilliant orator. His father was even better. His son was even better, from what we understand and write. He was a vain man as well. His son, I read that his son, and I didn't read the primary source, but the secondary source in Worms Giza's book talks about him coloring his hair because he didn't want people to know that he was getting old. And that is Greek. By the way, if you don't know, I mean, for us in this society, you know, all the surgeries, the Botox, the enhancements, the liposuction, the creams, the hair coloring, folks, that is as Greek as it comes. That is so Greek. As a matter of fact, you know, in the first Maccabees, it talks about the men who were so sensitive when they would wrestle nude in the Greek gymnasium, who were Jews. They were circumcised, and you could see that visibly. They were ashamed of it, and they didn't want to be associated with that. They wanted to be Greek, so they sought to surgically reverse those circumcisions so they could be more like the culture. And he was right in the middle of that. He loved Roman culture. He would talk like a Jew. He would sometimes act like a Jew. He built the temple. Remember Herod's temple that we talked about? He built that on his own dime. He did not use federal or funds for that. He used his own money for that. Why? To curry favor with the leadership of Israel so he would have a peaceful reign. Now, peaceful was not always the best word for that, because we know from the text what happens during his reign, especially the latter part. But this is the man who lived like that. Let's move through. Spice trade, he controlled a lot of it. He built one of his great signature pieces of architecture and work was the city of Caesarea, which controlled a lot of the trade. They had a harbor that was extended out into the ocean. None like had been built other than in Athens. It was an amazing place, and it brought in Herod a lot of money. Let's take a look at a few places. This is the Herodion, and this is one of the few places that Herod named after himself. This is it today. Essentially, this is what it used to look like, and this is it today from the view of a helicopter. It's not the best view. This is not the best picture, but it's okay. It gives you the idea. This structure went up, and this is one of the amazing buildings that Herod built for himself because he was afraid that Cleopatra was actually going to try to steal his land. And so he was always paranoid that somebody was going to come and take from him what was his. So he had actually built a series of fortresses moving south toward his homeland, the last of them being Masada. Now, you remember Masada. We've talked about that a little bit in my previous classes, at least. There's some very, very interesting things I just want to talk about just a little bit in this place. This is just a stone's throw, maybe 2 miles or so south of Bethlehem. As a matter of fact, when you stand, this is looking, I believe this is looking south. If you look north, you can see the city of Bethlehem laying in the cradle of the land. You can see where the land of where the fertility stops, because the way the geography is there, you can literally put 1 foot in the green and 1 foot in the desert. It's that defined. And this is something, and this was in place. This building, this amazing structure, was in place at the time of Joseph and Mary. When they came to Bethlehem, this is probably something that was there when Joseph lived in Bethlehem. He would have seen this for sure. Herod's presence always in the distance. As a matter of fact, in Jerusalem, you can stand on the Mount of Olives on a clear day, see the Herodian. It's only 5 miles away. So this is an imposing presence of this king that lives just there, just a little bit south of where Jesus was born. Now this man here is, and this is very interesting to me, I'll never forget it, 2007, I was on a tour in Israel. We land and we look at the front page of the newspaper and it says, Herod's tomb found. And I thought, what a day to arrive in Israel. I'll never forget it. It was in May. And this man, who is Ehud Netzer, famous Israeli archaeologist, had been digging there for years. Everybody knew from Josephus that Herod's tomb was at the Herodian, but they never knew where. So they dug and dug and dug and dug and dug, and they finally found it. As a matter of fact, I got a new picture of it. This is inside the Herodian. Wish we had more time. If we ever go there, we'll take you inside and show you all the amazing things in there. But this is from Lean Rittmeyer, one of the best archaeological artists out there. And so you can see that he's protected his image there. But the bottom line, this is what it looked like. Would have been, and he did this where there's always a constant breeze up there as well. You go up to the Herodian, it's very refreshing from coming down low, where it's hot on a dry day, to going up top where there's always this nice cool breeze. For somebody that didn't have air conditioning, that was a real luxury to be able to have that. Herod had his own personal theater here, sat about 300 people, and then this was his tomb. This is where he is. This is where he was buried, all torn down since those days. This is Ehud Netzer, and this is the sarcophagus that they found. And this used to be the sarcophagus, almost beyond question, that held Herod's body. Obviously, it was found in pieces. If you go back a few pictures, remember he was holding a big stone? Well, that was like the first piece of it. Well, since 2007, and between 2007 and 2010, they put it all back together, what they could find of it, and this is what they start to see. Obviously, just a few things here. You notice the fine workmanship of this sarcophagus. You also see no animals or anything like that. You see these beautiful ornate flowers or symbols. That was very, very Jewish because, again, a Jew would never put an animal or an image on their own building project, so to speak. Now, the funny thing is, it's not funny. This man, in 2007, discovers this. One of the most famous archaeological people in the world. He comes out, and he's working out here 3 years later, almost to the day. 3 years later, he brings a friend of his on a tour to talk about the Herodian. And there's a banister of wood, and he sits on the wood, and it gives way, and he dies at the Herodian. It's an absolutely amazing story. People read a lot into that. I don't do that. We won't waste your time with that. But it's an interesting story nonetheless. So Ehud is gone. And nevertheless, we have a lot owed to this man for the archaeological evidence that we have that even supports the Bible, not just Judaism. He did a lot for archaeology, and I would have loved to have met him. This is Caesarea. This is one of the main port cities. You can see this is an artist reproduction. This was Herod named it Caesarea because why did he name it Caesarea? Now that you know that, why would Herod name that city Caesarea?
He's trying to get in good for.
Of course he is. He's calling. It's also known in the Bible as you can pronounce it a couple different ways. Caesarea Maritima or Maritima, which means maritime is on the ocean. So if you see Caesarea Maritima, or however you want to pronounce it, that's what they're talking about, is this location. Paul spends time here in Acts. It's lovely to go through this city. Herod has a massive palace here. As a matter of fact, this is where Paul spends time under house arrest, is in Caesarea. We know that Pontius Pilate made his headquarters here in Caesarea, a very prominent place, a headquarters, if you will, for the Roman presence in the Holy Land was here. So very, very interesting place. Also very, very Greek, very, very Romanesque place. You see just a few things. You see a lot of technology here. You see a 17-mile aqueduct. Show you some pictures of that in a second. You see the Colosseum, or the theater. The theaters were secondary. Jews didn't like the theater because all the junk that went on there. They really didn't. Does that sound familiar? Do Christians like the theater? I hope you don't like it too much, because I just know about every movie you see out there today is not worth going to see. It's actually very contrary to what the text is. Surely there's one every now and then that comes out, but generally speaking, you get this. It's the same deal. It's the same deal. Let's go look. Herod's palace, which is around here, and this picture's a little off because there's no hippodrome. So this isn't exactly what it would have looked like, but I like this picture, and it was generally a decent representation. This is the remnants of the swimming pool of Herod's palace. I know that doesn't look very famous. Now, I haven't verified this through any source of mine. Ray Vanderlaan says that was a freshwater swimming pool. So you get that. I don't know how they do that, but beyond me, I don't know. You know, this is the first place that they use cement. The cement they would pour to make this harbor, a very amazing inventions here. A lot of this cement that they would use would be poured underwater, and the cement would harden underwater. Now, I'm not a builder of any stretch, but evidently, according to Vermes, this was one of the first places they used that type of technology in engineering to protect from the ocean and the seas and things like that. They just didn't stack stones up to make this amazing harbor. They actually poured concrete of some sort. So this is the remainder of his pool. And so when we know that the Apostle Paul was in the palace of Herod and he was under house arrest, give or take a few feet, left or right, up or down, he was there. And at minimum, you know he can look out over that beautiful ocean and know that he would have saw the same thing. And that's why I love the ocean and the woods. You know, you go to the woods, and I love, one of the highlights of my life was riding a horse through the woods, and I didn't see anything that was 20th century. All you saw was woods and the head of the horse, and you could have been back in the Civil War or earlier. I love that type of being in a place where you can enjoy something like that. This is the same thing here. Caesarea, boy, I'll tell you, you know what's sickening is to go to Israel and be able to spend an hour or two here. It's sickening. I got to go back and spend like 2 or 3 days here because there is so much. Divers, even today, can go out into the ocean and they can enjoy and see all the work of Herod that's now underwater. Divers go out there. It's an archaeological park. So if you have a scuba tank, I know, where's Ron Murray? He loves to do that. There you go, Ron. You got what I wouldn't do. I can't scuba dive. I don't have a license. If I went under the water, I'd never come up. So for people who do that kind of thing, you can enjoy that there at Caesarea. Here's the aqueduct, amazing structure. And the reason we're focusing on this is to give you a mental image of Herod. This aqueduct carried water into this amazing city from about 17 miles away on Mount Carmel. Now, if you know where Mount Carmel is, you know that was the same mountain that Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal on. That's another story. But 17 miles of this beautiful aqueduct still is there today. Doesn't function, doesn't hold water, but it's there as a testament to Herod's greatness and all the things that he did to build and to really put Israel on the map as far as buildings go. Herod, again, to the secular world, was actually a pretty amazing guy. Springs. Yeah, it's amazing. You go to Israel and you'll see water coming out of a rock. You go down the middle of the Negev and say a place like Engedi or today, some of the other national parks down there, and you'll go into a place like Engedi and you'll be walking through this nasty, dull, dry desert, and then all of a sudden, boom, and here's water just coming out from a rock. And you can't, I've even got down on my hands and knees at the spring source and tried to see where's the water coming from the rock. You can't even see the crack where it's coming from. It's just boiling up. And it's the most fresh, cold, refreshing water. And you see that imagery all the way through the Psalms and different places. I am living water, Jesus says. He cries it out at the feast. so on and so forth. So here we see 17 miles of this amazing structure bringing water. You know what an engineering marvel that is, to keep that level and to keep that water running down that far. There had to be a lot of thought put into that. This is the remainder of the hippodrome. A friend of mine and I were walking in this area right here, and he, our guide told us something that I know is not right now. Our guide at the time was a young man, and he said, "Oh, if you find a souvenir like a rock or some piece of marble, you can keep it." I'm like, "Oh no, you should never do that." But we were walking right through here, and I couldn't find anything. I mean, I couldn't find anything. I was looking because I wanted to come up and put something up on my mantle to always think about Caesarea. And he looked down into the surf right in here, not in the surf, but right there, and there was this little piece of marble sticking up out of the sand. And he went over, I will never forget this, he went over and he grabbed it by the top and he pulled it out, and it was a piece of marble about like this that was square, beautiful piece of marble, obviously there from human hands. And essentially the Romans destroyed this place, and when they destroyed it, everything went into, they shattered it. And even today, it was so neat to be able to see him pick up a piece of marble that some craftsman laid there many millennia ago to place for the glory of Herod and Rome. Amazing still to see today that you can still see the remnants of that. So sure, go ahead.
Did he keep them?
Yes, he did. It's not there now for us to enjoy. I hate that, but you know, that's what happens when, you know, that happens a lot in Israel, by the way. That happens a lot. Most of the, let me show you another thing that's real. That hippodrome, by the way, I don't want to spend too much time on, this is Greek. All this whole deal with love of sports, that is so Greek and Roman. Jews, if you notice, Jews just didn't, in the Bible, there's not a whole lot of talk of sports. But when you get to the Greek world, you get into Paul when he's talking to the Greeks, then he starts talking about run the race with perseverance, who cut you off, all these different sports analogies. Why? Because he's talking to people who understand sports. Jews, you might be lucky to have a game every now and then. My goodness, hasn't the time flown? I was going to spend one day on Herod. Prior to 60, 62, something like that. This is the Pilate stone. This is actually a cast of it. The real one's inside the museum. I was so glad that they actually took it inside. But this is a cast of it, and essentially it shows this is the only archaeological evidence that has something with Pilate's name on it, other than manuscripts and text and historical texts. But this proves Pontius Pilate. Wasn't available until the last 30, 40 years. Actually, it would be 40, 50 years. We didn't have it. You would have to step out in faith to believe that Pilate existed. Isn't that something? No time for that. And then finally, Masada. And I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm not going to rush through Herod. What we'll do is we'll start through, I'm going to finish Herod next week, but let's read the text. I don't want to leave us without reading the text, because we've got more to say, and I've even condensed it from when I started. But chapter 2, verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem, Bethlehem means the house of bread, by the way. Beth means house, Lehem means bread. No more befitting place for the bread of life to be born than the house of bread. In Judea during the time of King Herod. Don't you read that just a little more differently? Do you have a little bit more insight now into, this man is mentioned at least 9 times throughout the book of Matthew. And every time, and we're not done yet. We're not done with Herod. We'll come back to him next week, because when you see Herod, there needs to be an explosion of knowledge into your mind that knows what that means. Because it does make a difference in the context of the stories that we read in the Bible. Let's close with a prayer today. Lord, thank you again for your amazing word. And, thank you for coming in a time in history where they built with stone. And these materials that last even until today, so that we have this testimony of the truth. We see that your word stands up against criticism. It stands up against doubt time and time again. And we're grateful for that you have arranged that for these things here to be a witness for us, so we can go forward in all truth. In Jesus' name, amen.